Hello and welcome to the Existential Station. I'm Dr. Chris Bradshaw. This podcast aims to create existential fuel. That is, energy to enhance our ability for greater presence, meaning, awe, AWE, conscience, transcendence, and conscious love. In today's episode, I'm flying solo and will attempt to expand on these ideas and experiences I just mentioned. Many of the episodes for this podcast will be me flying solo. Most of them will be audio only. However, I'll also have some guests on, and often those episodes will be video recorded. Who knows, maybe I'll video record some of my solo efforts. But the one time I've done this in the past, it felt a bit odd looking into the camera only. At least this way I can look at the art on my walls or close my eyes and kind of tune inward. Or I can imagine that I'm talking to current and future friends. So we'll see how that goes. Before I get started with today's episode, I'd like to give a taste of some of the future guests and subjects this podcast will engage. Episode 2 has already been recorded a little while ago. This was a video recorded conversation with a friend and colleague of mine, Maria Reardon. Maria is a social worker and psychotherapist in Florida, and we discussed the relationship between the body, relationships, and spirituality. So kind of how our somatic experience of our bodies interacts with emotions in relationships, attachment, and what this has to do with spirituality. When we're talking body and feeling and spirit, how they kind of interact. In a future solo episode, I'm going to explore subjects such as artificial intelligence and its role in the mental health field as I see it. And also I'm going to opine some on where I think for-profit corporate mental health care companies tend to go wrong in terms of their treatment of clinicians and clients, and maybe some ways where they go right, in my opinion, and how things could improve in that area. In all these subjects, I'm taking what I consider to be a depth and existential lens, and it'll become more clear what I mean by that. And why I do this, I've always had a fascination with, and I've often enjoyed, first radio and then podcasts. I don't have as much time these days for them as I would like. There's a few podcasts that I try to catch every few weeks, or at least every month, and listen to some. But I like this opportunity to delve deep, whether I'm by myself or with others. I feel like recording these conversations can kind of heighten things and can help me be present in an interesting type of way. So I'm really engaging these because I like the experience of being in deep question. I don't know that I have definitive answers. There's some things I feel more certain about than others. I've got a good amount of experience as a human and as a professional working in the mental health treatment field. But I feel humble about the process of talking about some of these ideas, and I'm certainly not trying to give big definitive answers. I like to be open to the mystery of things, and I like to approach things as Socratically as possible. But anyway, enough of that caveating and whatnot. Let me dive into what I wanted to talk about today. So this idea for the name of this podcast, it came from, I have a blog with Psychology Today called The Existential Station: Fuel for Presence, Meaning, Awe, and Transcendence. It's a lot of big words in there. And I think of this podcast as a way of kind of expounding and expanding on that. Something I like about writing for Psychology Today is it has to be succinct. I like the layout, how they do things. You can put images in, but things have to be very succinct, like 1,000 words or less. And so when I write for them, I end up having to cut out a lot. And so I'd like to expand on it free form a little bit. And I haven't written out everything I'm going to say today, but I'm going to talk about these subjects. So what do I mean by presence? Let's start one at a time here. So part of this station, the existential station, I want to hopefully provide some fuel, some energy for myself and hopefully for you to be and to become present. And I want to say right away that presence can be an intimidating word and it can feel very judgy. Like, oh, here we go. We all got to be present all the time. Present, present, present. Ay, ay, ay. It's so hard to do. But here's the thing is judging ourselves for not being present enough is at the end of the day just another example of not being present. Let's talk about what do we mean by presence. One way of thinking about presence comes kind of from a mentor and friend of mine, Kirk Schneider, who's a great existential psychologist and writer. And I'm going to paraphrase and maybe add some twists to it, but the process of holding and illuminating what is palpably significant in our life in the moment, what feels significant, what matters to me right now. It could also include what is my body experiencing right now? What types of emotions do I notice right now? That's presence. Presence doesn't have to be enlightenment. It doesn't have to be forcing myself not to think about the past or the future. Maybe in the present, I'm judging myself for not being very present. Some would say that as human beings, we have a longing to be here in our life and to listen deeply to those we love and to be able to listen to our conscience when we're interacting with others. And we have a tendency to go off on flights of fancy and associative thinking and to get lost in our thoughts or to get stuck in a ego-based reaction to someone. The next thing we know, we're arguing with someone or we're having resentful or envious thoughts and we get pulled away. And then we kind of come back to our senses and come back to ourselves. That this kind of dance of presence and dissociation or presence and automatic reacting, it's all part of the human process. And as I see it, there's really no need to judge ourselves for it and be harsh with ourselves. And yet, I also don't want to completely not judge myself about it. I don't want to be flippant about it. I don't want to, for me personally, I want to make as many super efforts as I can for as many moments as I can in my life to be and to become present in my life. And to make some choice about when I'm going to think about the past or the future, or to make some choice to stop myself from thinking about the past and to listen deeply to my lover. So I want to make big super efforts. And I even want to feel some remorse, some bit of pain when I don't. When I want to listen deeply to my lover and I end up thinking about that I'm finding them boring, or I end up ruminating about my past, and then I come back to my body and I notice that I'm here with them and I look at them and that they need to be heard, I want to feel a little pang of something that reminds me that it matters to me. So I don't want to be too easy peasy, loosey goosey with myself. And yet I don't want to be harshly judgy with myself. That's where I'm at with presence. We could say presence is being grounded, here in the moment, sensing my body, using my body as an instrument. What am I feeling right now? Am I getting tense? Am I feeling anxious? I'm aware of it. And, the classic definitions of presence: mind, body, emotion, spirit, right here, right now, listening. I'll come back to presence. Okay. So fuel for presence. I'm interested in ideas and ways of speaking and ways of connecting that inspire some presence. Meaning and meaningfulness. Well, the first thing that comes to mind with me when I think of meaning and meaningfulness is actually trauma and actually pain. When I am here with my lover and wanting to listen deeply to her, and I start thinking about other things, that's normal. I dare say every human being experiences it. Don't have to judge myself. And yet I want to bring myself back because I value she listens deeply to me. I want to listen deeply to her. Feels fair, feels good. That process of having been pulled away and coming back, that is a meaningful process to me. It doesn't mean that it can't be meaningful without me being pulled away, but I do think something about having the option of having an egoistic response or judging the person or manipulating the person or ignoring them and then not doing it, or starting to do it and then not do it, or falling into it and then coming back, or even maybe at the higher levels of development. If I could imagine, let's say I'm listening to my lover and there is a option to start thinking about something else and to pretend that I'm listening. Let's say that's an option. But let's say I'm so evolved as a human being that it's no longer really an option, but there's some energy that represents. I believe that's kind of there's an interval there, there's a moment there. Let me be more specific about this. Let's say I'm someone that, I don't think that I really am, but let's say that I'm someone hypothetically that had a tendency to very often pretend to listen to my spouse and not really listen. And then I went into therapy, or I developed a serious yoga practice, or became a yoga instructor, or started reading some really well-written psychological books or self-help books or something. And anyway, I developed a value of not wanting to do that anymore and wanting to actually listen. And in the beginning, I catch myself doing that and I bring myself back. And then eventually that little bit of impulse to start pretending so that I can think about something else, there's really no longer a danger of it going into that. It's just there's some type of little energy there. There's something that I could do, but it immediately gets alchemized or transferred into a deeper listening. I think that tendency as humans is a meaningful one. What else makes things meaningful? So in a nutshell, I'm saying from an existential humanistic psychology standpoint, we could say that we want to come into a deeper presence, and we have things that block us from that. And that's part of the human condition. And sometimes we need those things to block us. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we want to choose. We don't want it to be so automatic and dominating. Usually the things that block us from a deeper presence are protective. They're trying to protect us from something. And basically, as human beings, we can keep ourselves safe, quote unquote safe, by creating a prison for ourselves and locking ourselves in the prison and locking everybody else out of the prison. So we're safe in a prison. And we would like to have the key to put ourselves in the prison when needed and to let ourselves out when needed, to basically have a fortress we can go into when needed, but then venture out into the forest and explore and live our lives. So the process of discovering that and working with that is a meaningful process. What else do I mean by meaning? For me, a meaningful life for me is a mix of pleasure, fun, excitement, artistry, service, and integrating as many of these things as much as possible. We all have things we have to do in life that we don't find very fun. Maybe some have more of those things than others. I've certainly had long periods of my life where I had a lot of those things. But when we think of a meaningful life, speaking of it a little less metaphysically or abstractly, like I've been so far, what makes life feel meaningful to me? I think a lot of folks would say that meaningful time with family involves some fun, some pleasure, some joy, some spontaneity, as well as some deep connection. What do we mean by deep connection? Well, I think it varies, doesn't it? Some people mean talking about deep, difficult things. Other folks might mean, not necessarily, just spending time and seeing the person and hearing the person and seeing their laughter and really being with them. So the other thing I think of when I think of meaning is looking beneath the surface at day-to-day things. So I wrote a piece for Psychology Today. It was a 2-part series on caffeine. And the first, of all the things I've written for Psychology Today, this was definitely the most popular. I think that I wrote a piece called Caffeine and the Fear of Death. And I think it had something like 12,000 reads or something like that, which is pretty high. I think it was about that many. I'd have to look. I stopped looking a while ago, so it seemed like it was in that, going towards that number. But and an interesting experience I had is that a lot of folks in my life, even though literally I think one of the first sentences of the blog is that this is not an anti-caffeine blog, but man, I think damn near everybody I know got a little defensive that they assumed it was going to be anti-caffeine, and it's not anti-caffeine. But even writing about caffeine, people get defensive right away. I gave a kind of a lecture, a talk at a facility on that piece, and which is really about psychological, emotional, physical potential benefits and risks to caffeine, and also what does our caffeine use actually mean? and I'm not going to go into it here, but what existentially, philosophically, spiritually are we getting from caffeine? Because we can talk about the neuroscience of it, and that's good. And human beings are biological and physiological and scientific, but that's not all we are. We are also metaphorical and artistic and spiritual. And I think, anyway, I'm not going to get into critiquing the different camps who sometimes like to pretend that everything is all about their discipline. But so by meaning, I also mean looking beneath the surface at day-to-day things that we might take for granted. Um, and so I'll come back to that in a minute. But so we have presence and meaning. We also have awe, 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 the state of awe. Kirk Schneider defines awe, I think, roughly as the humility, the sense of humility and wonder for the adventure of living. I think other places he or maybe other people have talked about the dread and excitement for living, for this life that we have, that we know we have a limited amount of time, and yet we're inspired by beautiful natural landscapes, the Grand Canyon, the sunset, when you're sitting next to a loved one, watching the sunset, when a baby is born, when you see an example of a human being who is struggling to do what is right or is doing what's right against some type of odds. You know, I think of Dr. Martin Luther King at the segregated lunch counter. Those black and white photos that I've seen of him being arrested at an all white lunch counter and passively resisting. And someone that there's something about us as human beings that when we see someone sacrificing something for what is good and right, putting themselves at some type of risk or going against the odds, that we feel a deep stirring of something. And conscience. I've added conscience in here because I think that sometimes it's useful to make a distinction between morality and conscience. And basically, one way we could think about this is that morality is kind of culture specific, culturally programmed, may vary considerably between cultures. And maybe some would argue against this idea, but I tend to gravitate towards the idea that conscience is something else. Conscience tends to be, if not universal, it tends to be something that speaks to a very wide range of human beings and a very wide range of locales. Well, for example, I mean, Dr. King is a renowned figure in a lot of countries. For example, not just the U.S. And when I think of conscience, this sense of remorse. If I do wrong by somebody and I feel something, oftentimes I think in society we end up spending a lot of time and energy with more surface level guilt, maybe. Someone's, let's say, striving to have a perfect body and they feel guilty for eating a small portion of ice cream or something. or or someone striving to be a perfect parent, and we feel some guilt for that. We can end up very, very neurotic, and unrealistic and harsh around things like guilt. And then I think we can overcorrect by just constantly knee-jerk, automatic, encouraging our loved ones to basically never feel guilt or remorse. And yet, in the legal system, when it comes to people that have committed crimes, one of the things that the judge and the attorneys are looking at is, does this person feel remorse, right? So I think similar to anger, at least U.S. society, from what I've seen, we have a very odd relationship with probably all of these ideas that I'm exploring here, but definitely with anger and with guilt. We have a very odd relationship with it. We don't want to feel guilty. We don't want anyone else to feel guilty. And yet we end up feeling guilty about all kinds of things that maybe we shouldn't. And yet, do we feel a deep enough conscience? Can we feel a sense of remorse for the state of humanity in general? It's very, I think of this sometimes when I think of personally, I'm going to reveal some of my political opinions, but it's always, even as a white male, it's always made sense to me that there should be some type of truth and reconciliation and some type of reparation around the institutionalized slavery that happened in the history of the United States. And it seems like some other countries, maybe did a better job of addressing formally and therapeutically addressing past wrongs. And I understand where I know there's a certain amount of white people who get very defensive at that idea, very quickly defensive at that idea of, well, they might say, well, I know the history of my family, my white family, and we never were in a position to have slaves. We never had slaves. We were laborers, or we were, that's not only was I not involved in that, but no one down my line was involved in that. I understand that. And yet, so I understand the argument that I shouldn't be feeling personally guilty for that. I'm not saying that I do or don't feel personally guilty, but I'm saying I understand the argument of saying I don't feel personally guilty for that. But when we think of conscience, human conscience, so if we entertain this idea, whether you buy it or not, that there's a culturally specific morality that we need to function in our day-to-day, current, contemporary cultural societies, and most of us are part of multiple cultures. For example, I identify as an artistic person, and there's a certain amount of resonance I can have with other artistic people, particularly people who are artistic in a similar way to me. And that there's a certain level of connection that can transcend race and socioeconomics. But then there is also race and socioeconomics, and there's sexual orientation and spiritual affiliations, and so there's different cultures. But so we have to navigate those cultures and in the time that we're living, and there's going to be senses of how each culture does things, quote unquote, and their sense of how things function best and how people get along best and how things cooperate and what things mean, etc. So there's going to be that morality, and then there's conscience. That possibly, let's just entertain the idea, I don't know for sure, but it seems to resonate deeply within me that conscience may transcend time and cultures. Maybe. We don't have to have definite answers. Even though I'm a psychotherapist with a doctorate degree, and I don't have to have definitive answers, and you don't always have to have definitive answers. But so as a human being, when I reflect back on the history of humanity, and I think of some human beings being taken from their home and enslaved and put on ships and often, raped and tortured and beaten and made to feel small or manipulated and denigrated, or all these different things. I can separate me personally, what I may or may not have done, and my conscience can say, yes, something needs to be said and done on behalf of that, in order to um, just respect humanity and what people may have went through, and then also the legacy, because as we know, and I do have a lot of training and knowledge in how trauma operates. This idea that some have, that because something happened to earlier generations, current generations can't say that they suffer from that. That's really not how it works. Things do pass along. Human beings pass things down. Good things, bad things, things in the middle, um, ambivalent things. Things get passed. So there is a legacy of slavery, like there's a legacy of anything. I had childhood trauma, and there's a legacy within me of that. And so my conscience as a human being, I think, is aware of that. Now, someone could say that, it's probably more that you were raised with certain political views, or you were raised in certain ways, that it's actually your culturally programmed morality that believes in that there should be reparations or some type of reconciliation, truth and reconciliation around that. And I would say that yes and no, that my culturally programmed morality is involved. Some of it is and some of it isn't, but I think it's something deeper. So conscience. So I'm going to be attempting to explore conscience here. Transcendence. That was next on the list. Transcendence. Scott Barry Kaufman is another teacher of mine and is a great psychologist, and he wrote a great updated book on Maslow, who's often misunderstood. Maslow is, and for those that have only seen the pyramid, you got to actually read some of Maslow, or start with Scott Kaufman's work and then read a little bit of Maslow, and you'll probably be surprised. And So transcendence, I believe one thing Scott talks about and one thing Maslow talks about is we have needs as human beings. We have needs for security and we have needs for growth. Um, Sometimes we can feel secure in our growth, and sometimes we can grow into our security. Sometimes sometimes we can end up a little bit split where um, because of my need to feel secure in a certain way, I'm cutting myself off from growth, right? So someone longs to have deeper, meaningful connections, and yet they're struggling with social anxiety, the intense fear of being evaluated negatively by people. And so in the shorter term, in a perpetual short-term benefit, they isolate at home. And they're not growing in the sense that they're not growing their social circle, literally. They're not growing from, human beings. We don't often talk about that we have this potential to help each other develop morally, spiritually, creatively. That friendships, yes, they can be about fun, they can be about support, they can be about safety, keep each other safe, and they can also be about psychological and spiritual growth and development. So security and growth. Some of the security needs that Kaufman and Maslow talk about is the need for self-esteem, to think well of myself in some way, to value myself and in my efforts, the need for connection. There's some other ones that I'm forgetting now. And growth needs, the need to explore, the need to love. Maslow had love as a growth-oriented need. And I think a lot of people that have been in long-term, let's say, committed romantic relationships, or who have long-term, deep, committed family relationships or friendships, that, will often say that, yes, at some point, in order to continue that relationship in a meaningful, satisfying way, some growth needs to happen, that each individual needs to grow somehow, and then the relationship needs to grow, that they can't get too complacent. And so we have security needs, we have growth needs, and something Maslow and Kaufman have talked about is that we can't get all of our needs perfectly met all of the time. And there's more to be said about that. But if we can get enough of our needs met enough of the time, and we can orient ourselves towards doing things in life that are good for us and good for others at the same time. Maybe particularly, we should define what we mean by good, but good for ourselves and good for others at the same time, we can become open to transcendent states. And so there's an element of conscience, an element of morality to transcendence. So when I think of transcendence, I don't only think of peak experiences or psychedelic experiences, or but transcendent states. Those could be transcendent states, and transcendent states are often marked by a sense of flow or a sense of making a meaningful effort, and yet it's not an exhaustive or overwhelming effort. I think of a musician that practices their instrument very, very often, and then they have a performance and they go into a transcendent flow state where they're doing complex maneuvers on their instrument that were once difficult but now seem to be flowing. And then the last idea that I have here is this idea of conscious love. And By this, I mean, for me, this is at this point in my life and my spiritual psychological development, this seems like kind of possibly the highest state for a human being. And I don't just say love, I say conscious love, because I think that it's one thing to love a lover that you're very attracted to and that you find fun. Um, and it's one thing to love um, your own child who you have a strong biological, physiological, evolutionary connection to. And I'm not minimizing those things, because I know those things are very important and potent and can be difficult and can involve work in themselves often. But when I think of, for me, when I think of conscious love, I think of that saying, can I love my neighbor as myself? Can I love my enemy? Now, I don't mean by that that we have to be a naive, passive victim. Um, I don't think conscious love always has to be nice. I think conscious love could involve healthy aggression. I think that it's possible to oppose things and have conscious love. Um, I think it's probably even possible to hate pure evil and to have conscious love at the same time. I think as humans, we're capable of way more than we can always imagine, and that we're definitely way more capable than what the rational mind is capable of. So even if it doesn't seem to make sense to hate evil and have conscious love for the person that's doing something while opposing them aggressively at the same time, even if that doesn't seem to add up rationally, my response would be that then go beyond what is rational. Um, so this is a lot of me talking about a lot of big ideas. Um, what I'm going to talk about next, I think in my next solo episode, and I'm going to try to apply some of these ideas to the subject, is I'm going to delve into, I think, where some for-profit corporate mental health care companies um, may need to make some adjustments to things. Um, and I'm going to apply some of these existential ideas. I think that folks that even aren't working in the mental health care space, I think you might still find the podcast interesting, because um, it's kind of bringing some of these existential ideas into the business world in some ways, and into ideas around leadership, and the psychology. And I do think the psychology of greed can come in. And so I think it might be interesting to you, even if you're not working in the mental health care space. All right. So this has been my first attempt at a solo podcast. And I guess let me think of how I want to end these. Um, Sometimes as a mental health care professional, you can feel a certain pressure to give kind of tips and pointers. Um, and yet it's really hard to do that. And so, because every individual is so different. So I guess nonetheless, I'm gonna give it a shot, with a caveat that this podcast is definitely not anywhere close to psychotherapy. Um, these is just a person talking. These are ideas, and always don't do anything that doesn't feel safe. or that feels upsetting, seek a mental health professional. Nonetheless, what I would say is try to have some friendships, try to make some friends, or have some connections with people you feel safe with, emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, and yet that also can challenge you to grow and expand your mind at the same time. Find those people and listen deeply to them, and ask them to listen deeply to you. And see about having some moments of silence with them, maybe in nature, where you can just sit. I think a lot of times we feel pressured to talk all the time, and to be fun or interesting. A future subject for this podcast that I talked about some on another person's podcast, but I'm going to talk a little bit about from an existential perspective, the potential value that can come from experiences like boredom, loneliness, and guilt. Those can obviously be very dangerous experiences depending on what someone's situation is. A lot of people have relapsed on substance use issues because of a struggle with boredom. And I think it's a good idea to create a lifestyle where boredom, loneliness, and guilt are kind of not necessarily minimized, but transmuted or transformed or alchemized. But I do think that the other side of boredom can be meaningfulness. The other side of loneliness can be deeper love. And the other side of guilt can be hope. That's something that Rollo May, a great existential psychologist, has. I know he talked about the one. I think he talked about all of those. I think I'm getting some of that from him. But that is something that I've actually very deeply introspected on and applied to myself. And that's another aim for this podcast, is I'm really doing my best. And it's the same with the podcast that Sophie Archibald and I are doing, the Fully Human Psychology podcast, Dr. Sophie Archibald. I'm attempting to do my best to only talk about ideas that I feel like I've deeply introspected on and applied in my life, in an embodied way that I can feel in my bones. I'm not necessarily interested on just reading something and then rattling it off. I don't know if there's anything wrong with that, but I think there's a little bit of an overabundance of just talking constantly about all kinds of things. What are we actually able to apply? What are we really trying to apply? And that one around boredom and meaningfulness, you can notice it come out interpersonally. And there's something about the way we think automatically where, and I don't know if some of you are doing this now, but I know I do it some, is when I say that boredom can be a portal to deeper meaningfulness, there can be this tendency to go to, well, does that mean that I'm supposed to just be bored? Does that mean that I need to be bored more? Does that mean it? I don't mean that. But what I mean is, if we take an interpersonal example, let's say you have a coworker that you have meetings with, and you find the way they talk about whatever the work issue is, you find it to be boring. I'm going to take a sip of water, which is very boring to do on a podcast. But I live in the desert, and it's very necessary. So let's say I have a coworker that I find to be kind of boring. I have a meeting with them every week, and I have to listen to them drone on and on. I find my legs shaking, and I find myself, let's say I even find myself fubbing them. I don't know if some of you may have heard of the expression fubbing, which is when you snub someone with your phone. You snub someone by pulling out your cell phone and looking at it while they're talking. It's a new term that I learned. I actually learned it at the American Psychological Association conference last year. Fubbing. So they start getting boring, and my or being boring, and my legs start shaking, and I start fubbing them, but they don't get the picture. They just keep going on and on. And um, so an interesting thing to try, if it's not too triggering, would be sense your body when that happens. So what if that interaction, what if the aim of that interaction wasn't to convey to them passive aggressively that they're boring, or to escape the boredom, or to indulge in our own resentment or ego or whatever's going on? Or what if the purpose of the interaction wasn't to just suffer and be a victim to their boringness? Um, what if the purpose of the interaction became, I'm going to sense my body, and maybe first not try to change anything, just really to notice, to bring my non-judgmental attention. I like the idea that attention, pure non-judgmental attention, is an energy. Let's entertain that idea that it's an energy. And I'm bringing my attention to my body, and I'm noticing it. I'm noticing myself getting tense with this person or whatever's going on. There's probably some type of tension. And then maybe I can work on that a little bit and allow myself to relax a little and breathe. Maybe I can force myself to have a little bit of a smile, like upturn the corners of my mouth just a little bit. I often find when I do that, when I'm being subjected to a boring person, that a mindful, more conscience-oriented, and often more culturally sanctioned way of responding to them seems to appear. Meaning, I might find a more graceful way to interject and to encourage them not to be boring. Uh, often when we do things like that, the other person's, I don't know, nervous system or intuition, whatever we want to say, senses something, and they often shift a little bit what they're doing. They often register something. There's something that happens. There can be a little bit of an interpersonal alchemy that happens. And so that's meaningful. To me, that's meaningful. That's part of what I mean is boredom as a portal to meaning. Or we could just interrupt the person and dominate the conversation. Either way. But I do like to challenge myself a little bit. I think self-compassion is important. I think kindness towards ourselves and others is important. I think that a lot of us tend to be very hard on ourselves, very critical. However, I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I don't think it's always bad to be a little harsh with ourselves. To be a little, there's certain words like hierarchy. That's a word that has negative connotations often. Um, uh, Harshness or judgmental. These are all words that have a lot of negative connotations because they can be abused and abusive, and worse than abusive, right? However, that doesn't mean they're always bad. And I find it inspiring and interesting to have certain hierarchies within myself. So, and to judge certain things. It doesn't mean I'm doing it in the worst possible ways that are some of the worst associations with those words. It doesn't mean that at all. So sometimes when I'm feeling bored by somebody, I do tell myself kind of sternly, I am an adult. Is the purpose of my life to be entertained and have fun every moment? Is that what I am here for? I don't think that that's what I'm here for. I think that I'm here for something very deep and meaningful. And often fun and entertainment will come from that and will come in general. And often it's important to let go and have fun. And of course, I'm going to spend more time with people that I find fun and interesting than people I don't, of course. And yet, I do think it can get very immature and silly how constantly people seem to be expecting to be entertained by every interaction. And I think that the phones and everything is really contributing to that, that a lot of times people are walking around. It's much more, I mean, we can see it in younger people. I think they kind of have an excuse. I think once you hit the age of 30, 40, for me, you know, the validity of the excuse starts to go down. I think the urgency of developing spiritually becomes more and more important as you get older. I do think that as we get older and older, the goal should be wisdom and gravitas and presence and inner calm. I think these things are important. I don't think the goal as we get older should be just to stay sexy and relevant and dominant and to have more and more and more fun. I think that, you know, I get a kick out of when, something I hear often is a lot of us get a kick out of when you meet an older person that doesn't give a fuck anymore and they say whatever the hell they want. Of course we get a kick out of it, but I think that there's something a little sad about that too, because I think what it is a kind of a perversion of what's supposed to happen, where what's supposed to happen is the ego is supposed to die off more and more, and there's supposed to be more gravitas and presence. But things aren't necessarily set up for that to happen in mainstream society. So what we get is we get more like colorful older folks who just express their opinions and to express whatever the hell they want. I think it's they're less inhibited, and sometimes maybe they come up with some gems or they'll come up with something, but I don't really think that that's where it's at either. I don't think that like being overly inhibited and censored and restrained and then just opening the floodgates later, I don't think that that's necessarily what it's all about. But so if I come back to the boredom and meaningfulness piece, I do tell myself, Chris, you're an adult, okay? It's okay that you're a little bored by this person. You're going to survive, okay? Now, I know that that is much harder if someone is dealing with some legitimate ADHD, anxiety, trauma responses, dissociative tendencies. There's a lot of things that often come from traumas, not always, that can make it very hard to regulate ourselves and to be present and to handle boredom. And boredom can be terrifying. And I think we need to talk about that. I think we don't talk about that enough. I had a philosophy professor as an undergraduate, Jacob Needleman, I think about this man every day. Um, and I remember as an undergraduate, he gave us an assignment. He said sometime, and this was before the internet. I mean, the internet might have been around, but nobody had it. We didn't know about it. Before the smartphones and all that. When he said, sometime this week, just sit in a chair in a room for 10 minutes. And right away we were like, well, what do you mean? He's like, he said, don't drink anything, don't smoke anything, because he knew us. Don't drink anything, don't smoke anything, don't eat anything. Try not to just figure something out. Try not to daydream. Just sit in a chair for 10 minutes. It was obviously torture for a lot of people. It was utterly impossible for some. And for those of us that could kind of pull it off, wow, you learn about a lot of things. And boredom will really put you in touch with the givens of existence, which we haven't talked about yet, but here, but it'll bring you up against some stuff. It might bring you up against conscience, and it might bring you up against culturally programmed guilt. And so, again, I tell myself, what is the purpose of human interactions? Is the actual purpose of human interactions to have fun and be entertained? I really don't think so. I think that that's a pleasurable byproduct that can happen often. And yeah, I think we should make an effort to be succinct. I'm talking on and on this podcast, but this is a completely voluntary activity that you're subjecting yourselves to. I'm not just I'm not your supervisor at work making you sit here listen to all of this. Yes, we can make an effort to be succinct and to know our audience. Whenever I do presentations at conferences, I don't just read from a script. I don't have slides on the PowerPoint that are just packed with information that I'm just reading from. I try to know my material, rehearse it, and I just try to get up there and connect with the audience about it. And I usually get some compliments on being engaging, and I usually beat myself up because I leave out some important points and some nuances because I'm not reading from something. So yes, we should make an effort to not be boring. And oftentimes when someone is being boring, they're cut off from their body, they're cut off from their feeling, they're droning on and on from the head, or maybe they have some type of anxiety or some social thing, and they're in a bit of a freeze response or a bit of a dissociated response. They're scared, and there's a lot going on when someone's being boring. And there's things we can do internally to help that process. So I'm going to spend some time with the podcast on things like this: boredom and meaning, guilt and hope, and loneliness and love, and some of these dialectics: freedom and responsibility, freedom and limitation, security and growth, acceptance and change. These are all dialectics where often some type of integration is needed. But sometimes we find ourselves anxiety and freedom, anxiety and creativity is another one. Sometimes we end up stuck on one side of the dialectic and terrified of the other side. So I'll spend some time with that in the future. So when I think of how I want to end this, I think that we are all in this together. There's big differences among us and between us, and yet there's some things that we share. And we all have a limited amount of time to live, and we have people and ideas that we care about, and there's a tension there. and there's a creative opportunity there. We have a deep need as human beings to be of service, I think, to other human beings in meaningful ways that are good and maybe even often pleasant, but certainly good in the deepest sense of the word, for us and for other people at the same time. I don't think there's any way to reach our potential as a human being without being of some type of service. I think we could become very wealthy or very esteemed or very attractive without being of service in deep ways to other human beings. But I think we will be cut off from our full potential. And one thing I'll end with here is a quote from James Baldwin, who's a great writer that I like. I love his novels, Another Country and Giovanni's Room. Really beautiful, engaging narrative and philosophy woven in and out just organically. But he said that we pay for our sins by the lives we lead. We may end up paying it otherwise. We may end up paying for it criminally or financially or in the afterlife, who knows, or a lack of an afterlife maybe. But we pay for our sins by how we're living our lives. And I like to think of sin as one of the original meanings of the word was to miss the mark. So meaning, why are we really here as human beings? What are human interactions really about? Yes, there's evolutionary things, there's this, there's that, but spiritually, psychologically, creatively, emotionally, what are human interactions really, really, really deeply supposed to be about? And when we miss the mark, that's when we sin.
Yeah.
And then we live that life. So someone who's being greedy and raking in too much money and taking advantage and lying and manipulating along the way, it doesn't mean they're not doing any good in their life. But if there's sin there, then they're going to pay for it by how they're actually living. So that could look like having a certain amount of pleasure and meaningfulness, but being cut off from the extent, the depth that is possible in terms of meaning. So that's what I'm going to end with. And I hope to see you all next episode.